Hi everyone, this is Rebecca from ChemKnits, and in today's episode of Dyepot Weekly, I sort of want to go back into time where all of my dyeing adventures began. Right here I have a skein that I made out of 170 grams of Lion brand Wool Ease Thick and Quick yarn. Now the Wool Ease yarn that I started dyeing was the worsted weight version, but this is still 20% wool, 80% acrylic. And this is the color of yarn that started my adventures of trying to figure out how to dye yarn at home. But since I've recently kicked it up a notch and started playing with commercial acid dyes, I wanted to try to use these commercial acid dyes on a wool acrylic blend to see how it does and how it feels. So today I'm going to be doing some kettle dyeing with a bunch of colors that I have left over from a sock blank hand painting that I did a couple episodes ago. So I am going to go ahead and pre-soak this skein into some plain tap water, and then we will get ready to start dyeing. So I have added about an inch of water to our dye pot. And I'm going to add about 3 tablespoons of white vinegar. So our yarn has pre-soaked for a couple of hours, and I'm sort of grabbing it directly from the pre-soak into this pot. I did not really pull out, and I'm squishing it because the acid is in our pot. Okay, so the level of water right now is not quite covering the yarn all the way. Oh, I will turn on the heat so this can start heating up. I'm going to add a little bit of water from the pre-soak, so that way our yarn can just barely be covered. And maybe I'll add a little more. You don't need the immersion to be too low. And so the dye that we are going to add today is a bunch of 1% stock solutions of the Jacquard acid dyes. And these dyes were, some of the colors were mixed together, but everything started off as a 1% stock solution and was not diluted. But we started with some primary colors, and I mixed to make a green and an orange, and I added a little bit of the pink to Jacquard violet to make it a little redder. So I used these in another video. I will link to the video where I mix the dyes in the description, so that way you can see the proportions that I use to get the different colors. But once this heats up, then we will add our dyes. Since what I'm using today, and I'm reducing the heat, since what I'm using today are all non-food safe dyes, this is a dedicated dye pot that I don't use for food. I only use this for dyeing yarn. And the same with the utensils and other stuff that I'm using today. Alright, so the first color I'm going to add is, oh funny, I need to stir this up a bit because there's some particles that crashed out from the sun yellow. But this was an attempt at an orange, but it ended up reading as very, very red. So I actually want to move, since there's so much of this color, I didn't want to add it straight on top of the yarn because I'm hoping to get some penetration towards the bottom of the pot. But a lot of the other colors are in squirt bottles, with the exception of this little bit of pink. So I'll add that right there. Now this yarn is only 20% wool, and the acid dyes are only going to dye the wool. Let's see if there's any colors that I have more of. I guess just the red and the orange. But you can see, you see in this bottle how there's sediment at the bottom. That is from the yellows crashing out, but with heat and additional water they should go in fine. But you can see that this color is a lot more orange the red was really, really potent. So if we were doing this on 100% wool yarn, we would get really, really deep colors, and maybe some pastels in sections, but we would see a lot of deep colors. What I've observed when I've used these blends of yarns is that you can almost see the difference of, look at how deep that red is. You can almost observe the different fibers within the yarn, and so I think that it's really cool. Wow, I had a lot of red left over. I'm really, really curious how deep these colors will penetrate. I have very, very little blue left, but I've got some green and black, and so let's do some yellow. We'll do some green. Very little of the blue. I wish, so this is Jacquard Sky Blue. I really wish that I had started with a different blue when I was picking my primary colors, because I guess sky blue is just overall a bit paler. But here's some violet. Oh, funny, because there's a little spot of, I found like a nice hole over there. So some purple. This pot actually looks really pretty right now. And here is some black. Okay. And now we wait. And so we'll see what happens with these vibrant, vibrant colors as we give them time to absorb to the yarn. So let's give this 20 minutes and then we'll come back and look. So I turned the heat back up about 5 minutes ago, and I realized something. We have 175 grams of yarn. I added a lot of dye, but only 20% of that is wool. We've got between 30 and 40 grams of wool fiber in here. There's still a lot of red all around, I think. Okay, red there. What about over here? Yeah, we've got some reds coming up over here as well. I am curious what's going on down below. I was just taking a little peek. I know that moved stuff around, but sometimes I just can't help it. Okay, well, I think I want to remove the yarn. Okay, I'm going to turn off the heat. I know that the first time that I used the red was actually in, look at all that. The first time, and you can see when I'm lifting it, the colors have become more muted sort of immediately. And that's sort of what I expect with dyeing these wool acrylic blends. But there's a lot of red left in there. Interesting. I'm just letting the last little bit run off. I could have left it in for longer and that wouldn't have been much of a problem, but I had a feeling that we could be approaching the limits of what we could absorb. So you can see our nice muted colors over here. And oh, it's so fun, and I don't think, maybe if I zoom in you could see, but the yarn looks super heathered, and so I think that is just really cool. So now I need to let this yarn cool completely before we wash it, and then we'll see how much color remains afterwards. But I'm actually going to turn the heat back on. We have a lot of red right here, so I think I might dip dye some 100% wool yarn in this red to see what we get. The heat is on high and we are just starting to see some movement here. In my hands I have 100 grams of 100% wool yarn that has been pre-wet but not pre-soaked. By pre-wet, I mean I just ran it under the tap to try to wet the fibers a little bit before we started doing the dip dyeing. Okay, so we are at a simmer. I will reduce the heat and start, so you can see that the yarn isn't going in super easily because the fibers are not 100% saturated. But we will use the spoon and sort of slowly dip in and slowly add a little more and a little more to the pot. If I had been planning on doing this, I would have pre-soaked the yarn, which would make this dipping process easier. But this still works to slowly add more and more fiber to the pot. And actually, I can already see that I'm getting a gradient. Now, I just want to be careful to not turn my hands red because I am not wearing gloves, but you can see that it's a lot darker down here than, say, even up there, even though we're a bit blown out right here. But even this is a bit darker than what we got on our wool acrylic blend. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and add the rest of this to the pot. And so the gradient is not super extreme. We have absorbed a lot of color so far. And you know, I think that our other yarn absorbed a lot of color as well, but we just had some left over. So I will come, let's just see where we are dye-wise right now. And so I'll come back in 5 minutes and check on our yarn. 5 minutes have passed, and there's still the tiniest amount of color in the yarn. Or sorry, there's the tiniest amount of color still in the dye bath, but most of the color is in the yarn. And you know, this compared to, you know, what we got with the blend, we've got a really nice depth of color in this red yarn. So I'm going to turn off the heat, but I'm going to let this cool off in the pot until I can remove it comfortably, especially since I don't have my tongs handy. And then I'll come back when we're ready to wash the yarns, and so we can compare the amount of color. It is time to wash our 20% acrylic blend. This is actually dried out a lot. Whoa! You see that? That, my friends, is some color coming out. I do want to find a tie on here. There we go. I don't want to mess it up too much. So it's not surprising that this red is coming out, especially given the color that we left behind in our dye pot. You know, if you have intense color left in the dye pot, then you will probably see some bleeding on your yarn. Cool. I think that these colors are actually really pretty. It's like a nice muted palette. But after a couple rinses, the water is already much clearer. So I started off dyeing this blend of yarn just with the worsted weight, you know, kettle dyeing it with Kool-Aid, and you know, I'd wind my skeins around the back of a chair, just kind of have at it. So I added some clear dish soap to the bath. Now, one thing I'll mention, and it would probably, when I'm dyeing these types of blends, be best to modulate the heat a bit, but heating up these does sort of kill the acrylic fibers a bit. The yarns become a little more flat and less round. But, I mean, I have a blanket knit with this blend of yarn and the original yarns that I ever dyed in my living room. And I don't think I used this much dye ever in any one skein. So, if you're itching to try, I guess I should probably say this on the conclusion, but if you're itching to try dyeing yarn at home, but you are having trouble finding 100% wool, you can try things with low wool content at your store. The colors end up being more muted, and part of the mutedness of these colors today comes from the fact that we mixed red with so many of these other colors. But, you know, if you were to just do green, you could have like a really nice green, but you're never going to get something bright and dark, at least when it comes to food coloring. But I was really, really curious to try acid dyes and see, you know, the difference of what you get here versus what we get in 100% wool is pretty striking. So anyway, our water is clear. I'll rinse this 1 or 2 more times, and then I'll hang up our yarn to dry. And then we'll wash our dip dyed red yarn. It is now time to wash our red dip dyed yarn. As this yarn was cooling, the dye bath has cleared considerably. This is a nice and rich red, and I'm not expecting to really experience any bleeding here. But I'm happy with how deep these colors are. I think they're really pretty. And so, you know, these are sort of like a, you know, it's almost a dusty kind of red, kind of like a coral. And I think that it's really pretty. And so tone-wise, this sort of goes with the acrylic wool blend rather nicely. But, so, you know, if those colors seem not so bright and muted, it's because, well, this isn't really a bright red, even though the color does have depth and darkness to it. But our water is already clear, so I am going to rinse out the soap, which will probably take 1 or 2 more rinses, and then hang up this yarn to dry. In this video, we dyed 170 grams of Lion brand Thick and Quick Wool Ease yarn that is 80% acrylic and 20% wool. We used some 1% stock solution of Jacquard acid dyes to space dye this yarn in a kettle. The resulting colors are kind of like a nice, cool, like pale pastel rainbow. We added a lot of acid dye into the pot, and a lot of the dye actually did absorb to this yarn. However, once we removed it, because we were pretty much only having reds left, we dip dyed some 100% wool yarn in the leftover dye. And just look at the difference between dyeing 100% wool, 100 grams of 100% wool yarn with Jacquard acid dyes, and then dyeing a wool acrylic blend that is only 20% wool. There are probably only about between 30 and 40 grams of wool in this Thick and Quick skein. but it did take up some color and some variation of color. And this is very, very similar to the dyeing projects that I started out with way back in the day when I started dyeing yarn. If you look really, really closely at the yarns, you can see that there's almost a heathered quality to the fibers. It is more obvious in some areas than others, but the wool is taking up the dye, whereas the acrylic fibers aren't taking up any dye. So if you look really, really closely, you can see the really dark strands of color that are within this yarn. It's just that since it is mostly acrylic, that the color overall ends up being rather pale. Our dip dyed red is beautiful. We have sort of a coral pink that gets deeper and deeper into more of a corally red from the yarn that was left in the dye pot a little longer. I do want to point out one more thing about dyeing wool acrylic blend yarns in the methods that we use today. It's probably advisable to use a bit of a lower heat because the yarns themselves are flatter than they once were. This is really, really soft, and so it could still turn into something fantastic, but the acrylic fibers, you know, they didn't melt. Like, you could still, I think, untwist this yarn and pull the plies apart, so it's not melted per se, but it is, you know, it had enough heat to alter the shape of the yarn. And so that is something that you might want to consider when you're doing your own projects. This blanket in the background is many, many years old, and in it has a mixture of undyed yarn, some commercially dyed yarns, which are the darkest, and then the first yarns I ever dyed with food coloring and Kool-Aid. And you can see that the colors in these yarns has held up really, really well over years. And this blanket has been washed multiple times and spends a lot of time out of a basket just on our couch or on a chair or something in our living room. Since I am starting this new journey of dyeing yarn with commercial acid dyes, it was really fun to go back and look at where I began in this journey, just with a twist, because instead of using food coloring, we're now using dyes that are intended to dye fiber. The wool acrylic blends do take up dye, and you can make really, really pretty variegated yarns. It's just you need to keep in mind that the overall color is going to be a lot more muted, because even with the 170 grams having access to all of the dye first, we still got a brighter, much more vibrant yarn on the 100% wool than we did on our wool acrylic blend. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I hope that you enjoyed this dyeing experiment where we used Jacquard acid dyes to dye a yarn with an extremely low percentage of wool. If you liked this video, please subscribe to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel so you can be notified when I release new videos and do live streams. I really like to explore with new techniques and experiment with different methods of applying dyes to yarn, and so I think that we have a lot of fun. Thanks for watching!